Good morning. Chris already let you know that we've been friends for a long time, and when she wrote to me a couple of months ago and asked if I would preach this morning, I was invited to share my story and how I'm called to creativity in the work that I do in the world. And as an ordained minister, when preaching, I personally really value the challenge of trying to stick to the lectionary text for the particular Christian season that we're in, which really has nothing to do with my story, at least not much more than my own faith journey, so we'll see how this goes. In many ways, I feel like the 40-something years of my life have been a type of Exodus story, a wandering in the desert with a strong side of faith. At some point or another, the plagues, the institution of the Passover, the songs of Moses and Miriam, the parting of the sea, and the provision of manna and quail in the desert have all happened in my life. Speaking allegorically, of course. I would like to say that it was a happy accident that I found my way to ordination through a Lenten faith study at Ladner St. Stephen's Pastoral Charge 16 and a half years ago. However, the United Church of Canada is a church that follows the Christian seasons, and it is common for congregations in our denomination to engage in faith studies during the season of Lent, the 6 weeks before Easter. In the early church, it was a time to prepare new Christians for baptism. And although I'm United Church 3 generations back, which is about, on both sides of my family, which is about as far back as you can go in a denomination that's 92 years old, I was preparing at the age of 25 for confirmation. I was studying to make a profession to reaffirm my baptismal vows, something I hadn't done in high school and now prepared to do as an adult in my mid-20s. Because 4 months earlier, on the first Sunday of Advent, I had felt a call to ministry. Now, almost 17 years later, today starts the first day of my 5th week as the executive director at First United Church Community Ministry Society. This year, I celebrate the 10th anniversary of my ordination into the ministry of Word, Sacrament, and Pastoral Care. I was ordained to further study, something that used to be much more common, but now is viewed with a healthy dose of cynicism because it can be seen as an escape from congregational ministry. 10 years later, having never served a pastoral charge other than the 10 months internship I did in Alsace, Saskatchewan in 2005 and 2006, I could say that maybe that cynicism is warranted. But I could also say that is to take a very narrow view of the ministry of Word, Sacrament, and Pastoral Care. It would take a really, really long time to explain to you how I got to here. So I'll give you the Coles Notes version and say, I was very active in the church as a teenager, but I left the church through university, not uncommon. I started by studying flute performance and orchestral studies at the University of North Texas, but I graduated from UVic with a bachelor's degree in history, intending to go to law school to become a tax lawyer specializing in First Nations tax issues. I ended up articling in the CA program with KPMG in their Aboriginal Services group instead, and a year into that program, my older brother committed suicide after a lifelong struggle with drugs and alcohol, and 6 months later, I got sober. 1 week sober, I walked into Ladner United Church on the first Sunday of Advent and sat down to an incredible sermon by the Reverend Sharon Moore Cook on the first Sunday of Advent, and she was preaching about the preparation for the possibility of a new life that was waiting for us in the Christ event at Christmas. I started to cry, and my whole body relaxed and said, "Oh, good, you can be a minister now." Immediately, I was overcome, and I thought to myself something that is now oft repeated in our home these days by our four-year-old daughter, "What the heck?" I stayed after the service and approached Reverend Sharon, explained to her what had happened. She asked me if I had ever experienced a call to ministry before, and I said yes. I'd thought about it in high school, but I hadn't stepped foot in a church in 8 years. And furthermore, I was only 6 days sober. She didn't tell me I was crazy. She didn't tell me to go away or that she didn't have time for me. She listened quietly and said, "Well, sometimes we spend some time in the desert wandering, trying to avoid that call. So maybe let's take a look at that." And so I did. In addition to working at the foundations of that new life that came in the promise of the baby Jesus that Christmas, I sat in discernment with the 3 ministers who served my pastoral charge that year. Alan Reynolds, who will be familiar to many of you, and the late Doug Graves led the Lent study in 2001. And I made a contract with myself that I would live my life every day as a woman of integrity, just loving people as an extension of God's grace. That is not to say that I have done that perfectly, by any means, but they are words that I hold in my heart, and when I fall short of being the good person I intend to be, they are my rallying cry that reminds me to just go ahead and do the next right thing. I felt early on in that time that I wanted to invest in deeper learning, that in addition to ordination, I wanted to pursue training as a theologian and earn my Ph.D. At the time, I thought with my business background, I would be most interested in ethics and the economy. But in 2005, I was selected as one of 3 delegates from the United Church to go to the 9th General Assembly of the World Council of Churches in Porto Alegre, Brazil. While there, I was elected to the Central Committee, the governing body of the largest ecumenical council of churches in the world, and then from there, elected to the executive of the Central Committee. So in addition to traveling to semi-annual meetings in Geneva for the Executive Committee, I had the opportunity to represent the WCC in international theological dialogues at the UN Permanent Forum on the Rights of Indigenous People, in drafting the People's Charter for Peace and Security for Life in South Korea, at an international gathering of Indigenous theologians that took place in Baguio City, Philippines, and I spent 4 years as co-moderator of the Palestine-Israel Ecumenical Forum Core Group, a group of staff from mainly European and North American denominations who do the delicate work of intra-Christian and interfaith dialogue about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the illegal occupation of Palestine. I graduated and was ordained in 2007 and immediately began my master's in theology, a postgraduate degree that is favored for ministers with a Master of Divinity to prove that we have the academic chops to survive the Ph.D. program. In 2008, without having finished my second master's degree, I moved to Berkeley alongside my friend Christine Boyle to start my Ph.D. program with a focus on the study of Christian mission from a First Nations perspective. In fact, I had intended at the request of the WCC to write my dissertation on Christian perspectives on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but much to the relief of my advisor, I realized that I didn't feel called to specialize in that subject, and I couldn't imagine talking about the conflict for the rest of my life. So I returned to the study of trying to define what Christian mission looks like to an Indigenous Christian theologian. While in Berkeley, I did my coursework, fell in love, wrote my master's thesis for my Th.M. at the same time as I wrote my comprehensive exams for my Ph.D., taught 3 graduate level courses while raising an infant, our son Gabriel David having been born in the summer of 2010. In 2011, with my Th.M. diploma in hand and my dissertation proposal completed and approved, I took a job working for a national environmental nonprofit based in Oakland called the Alliance for Climate Education. Their mission is to educate American high school students about the science of climate change and inspire them to take action. And to date, they've educated over 2.5 million American high school students about that science. I worked there through a second pregnancy, and our daughter Esperanza was born in the fall of 2012. I finished my 7-year term with the WCC on October 2013, which was a welcome relief. The 12 to 16 weeks of international travel each year was wearying with 2 small children. I left ACE in 2014 and joined the award-winning HR team at Galileo Learning, a company that creates amazing innovation summer camps for kids. Their mission is to develop innovators who envision and create a better world, which I loved because I thought if we could give these kids the innovation skills that they needed to grow up and tackle climate change, then we'd be one step closer to mitigating our impact on the climate. But I was homesick. And probably it did not go unnoticed by those who had approved my ordination to further study that I strayed quite a ways from the institution of the church. All the while, people would ask me, "What will you do when you finish your Ph.D.?" And I would think, I am doing what I will do after I finish my Ph.D., climate change happens to be the most pressing theological, environmental, political, social, and any other kind of problem of our time. But I was homesick. For an Indigenous woman from the temperate rainforest of British Columbia, 4 years of no rain during the height of the drought in California gave me what I like to call reverse seasonal affective disorder. I found all of the sunshine and lack of rain depressing, and I longed for the gloominess of gray, drizzly Vancouver winters. So in the fall of 2014, I started to look for work in Vancouver. And I stayed working in nonprofit leadership, coming to EcoJustice, which many of you may remember as Sierra Legal Defense, as their first ever director of operations in February 2015. EcoJustice, like a lot of other nonprofits, offers a staff break between Christmas and New Year's, and frustrated with lack of progress on my dissertation and the thought of having to pay tuition past spring 2016, I committed to finishing my writing during that winter break, and I did, thanks be to God. I graduated with my PhD in May 2016, and after 8 years of shushing all of the people who asked me what I would do when I was done, I was shocked and a little dismayed to find that it was me asking when I would return to the church. After all, I certainly hadn't chosen the easiest path to here. After almost 21 years of university, give or take a few semesters, full-time work, full-time school, and full-time mama to 2 kids under 6, not to mention also trying to carve out space to be a partner to my beloved esposo. Even though I was back working in Canada, I was still homesick. It's not surprising that after a decade of intense academic study, I had rationalized the professionalization of my career. I could make arguments for how what I was doing was ministry, and yes, the theological challenge of climate change is indeed the most pressing for us. But all the while, I was further and further from the simplicity of that contract I made with myself all those years ago. I am a woman of integrity, just loving people as an extension of God's grace. I was conflicted. I liked my job, and I loved the people at EcoJustice. Some are here today. I wanted to leave, and I didn't want to leave. And I certainly didn't want to leave if my leaving would create any kind of instability, however slight, realizing that my role was new and I had only been there 2 years. But I did yearn to be a theologian and a minister in service of the church, not just the world. The first time I spoke those words out loud and admitted to this sense of call I was feeling internally, I was in a theology committee meeting for the National Church in Toronto. We were going around the circle, sharing how we were each doing, and I finished my check-in by saying, I feel like I'm ready to come back to the church, but I don't know what I would do. A colleague, many of you will know the Reverend Dr. Brian Thorpe, shared during his check-in at that time that the executive director at First United had just resigned unexpectedly, something personal to him as the current chair of the board. And a familiar sensation overcame me and my body relaxed, and I thought, oh good, you can be a minister now. And so here I am, 4 weeks in as the new executive director at First United Church, an inner-city mission of the United Church of Canada, a church where my parents were married in January of 1975, the last time a First Nations ordained minister was in service there. A church on the downtown east side of Vancouver, Canada's poorest postal code, where the median income is less than $14,000 a year in a city where a living wage is $21 an hour. A church that has become a place where the homeless and hardest to house are treated with dignity, love, and respect. While the last decade has posed challenges, including pragmatic ones, like it's probably not a wise idea for 450 people to share a confined space in perpetuity, we have continued to witness to the struggles of the community we serve, despite the fact there hasn't been a worshiping congregation there for over 10 years. Our building needs significant upgrades or redevelopment, and the already overburdened staff are now faced with the trauma in our neighborhood and across the province resulting from the opioid crisis, including many times having to be the first responders to fentanyl overdoses in or around our building. It is nearly impossible to stop the import of bedbugs and other pests, although there are now systems in place to reduce the impact on our residents and our staff. And our space is so consumed by our 60-bed shelter, it's like trying to figure out a Rubik's Cube, trying to figure out space for other programming to happen. The first day I walked into our sanctuary, I was overcome with the pungent odor that accompanies a room full of homeless people off the street who come in for coffee, although I barely notice it now. On Friday morning, I stood and watched and held one of our residents in prayer as 6 paramedics revived him from some kind of coma. Whether diabetic or drug-induced, we couldn't be sure in that moment. I imagined my late older brother and felt gratitude that he didn't have to straddle the purgatory between life and death that is drug addiction anymore. And I cried for our community member on the floor at my feet as I prayed. And I watched his beautiful young body struggle to be revived as he was lifted away into the ambulance. Despair lurks around the corners of our church, threatening to take over. But where we boldly proclaim, no, hope lives here. And my heart is so full, I can barely stand it. This, for me, is where the staff has hit the rock and the water has poured forth in all its miraculous life-giving power. This is the best place I can think of to be a woman of integrity, just loving people as an extension of God's grace. Some people ask if First can still be called a church. While no one doubts the worthiness of providing shelter, clothing, and food to the needy, is it really still a church? For me, this ministry is the definition of church. Everything that we are called to do as Christians and as the United Church of Canada is at the heart of the downtown east side. For we are called not just to give of our excess, of what we can spare in our time and resources, we are called not only to worship together, we are called to give from our very being, from the impossible gift of giving that which we do not have, and walking with the hopeless in the certainty that there is, in fact, hope, even though we may not know it or see it. The fact of the matter is, as long as human bodies are broken and hurt and dying, we are doing and being church when we see that hurt and brokenness, when we name it, and when we refuse to walk away because we feel we have nothing to give. Like the living waters that flowed from the rock struck by Moses, God's grace is relentlessly expansive and miraculous. And this relentlessly expansive grace that says all are welcome, beautiful, and beloved children of God, all are worthy and precious in the sight of the divine, all will be healed and held and saved by God's grace. But that grace comes not through some omnipotent deity in the sky that we imagine looks like paintings of Zeus, some paternalistic figure we call Father who will shelter us and give us care. That grace happens when we fight for justice, when we, all of us, advocate for those who cannot advocate for themselves, and when we give the impossible, the gift of giving even when we have nothing left to give, the gift of presence and witness and refusal to give up or walk away. That is the call the God of life issues to us. The God of life calls us to fight for life. When the living waters flow from a rock, it is a miracle. Thanks be to God for that. Amen.